When you're dealing with insulin resistance, it's imperative to remember that you want to maintain a level of glucose tolerance too. What does that mean? It means that you don't want to completely detrain your body's ability to utilize carbohydrates. As a matter of fact, you want to get your body better at using carbohydrates. Remember that insulin resistance is not necessarily a problem with carbohydrates per se. It's an inflammatory issue that manifests in the improper utilization of carbohydrates. So what we want to do is we want to enable the body to use carbohydrates, albeit properly. So yes, make no mistake that one of the first things that people should probably do is reduce their carbohydrate intake if they're dealing with insulin resistance. Definitely not denying that. But it's also a tough pill for a lot of people to swallow if you tell them just straight up reduce carbohydrate intake. But if we strategize on how to properly carb cycle, then we can sort of have our cake and eat it too, following a few really simple rules. So that's what we'll break down. Please drop a comment down below for the algorithm. It helps us out a ton, and hit that subscribe button. After today's video, I put a link down below for SuppCo. This is a free app that helps you manage your supplements. It sounds kind of funny, but like I have my entire supplement stack in there. You can click on the link and actually check out my stack itself too, which is pretty cool. But it allows you to search for supplements based on a rating system. So it looks at things like oxidation, it'll look at things like clinical studies, and it gives a rating system so that you can shop for supplements that they have no affiliation with. They're not bought and paid for by these. They're just doing the work with looking at clinicals, looking at oxidation, looking at all these things so that you can make the best, most informed decision. So like I inputted my stack and I was pretty happy with all the ratings of the ones that I had already chosen. But you can do the same kind of thing. It's a free app, so go ahead and check it out. That link is down below. It's suppco.com/Thomas. That link is in the top line of the description. Highly recommend it. So the fundamental rule with carb cycling is to allocate carbohydrate load, but also somewhat the glycemic value of carbohydrates with appropriate activity levels for that day. Okay? Now that sounds really complex, but it can really be broken down into three very simple categories. Okay? On days that you are not that active, you simply keep carbohydrates lower. This does not mean that you add a bunch of fats. As a matter of fact, that was the mistake that a lot of people would make. They would go really high fat and then really low carb on that day, and then the next day go high carb and low fat, which has some merit for sure. But what you want to do on the days that you're reducing carbohydrate intake is you actually just want to increase your protein intake and let fat sort of naturally increase. Because we have to remember that if you're in a state of insulin resistance, as much as people do not like to admit this, high amounts of saturated fat, unless you're doing something like carnivore or very low carb, where that's really the only fats that are coming in, the fats can still contribute to insulin resistance, right? So what you want to do is you want to keep your fats under control and not just add a bunch willy-nilly. So if your carbohydrates are low, you might increase your fats a little bit, but more importantly, you're increasing your protein and you're letting kind of fat intake land where it lies, so to speak. And this way, on the days that you're less active, you're not adding in additional carbohydrate load. And we'll talk about timing here in just a second too. Now the next thing, the next sort of stage is if you are moderately active that day. Let's say you go and you resistance train, okay? You are going to be granted a little bit more slack. But resistance training is not super high intensity, and that's a big, big myth that needs to be debunked. Okay, a lot of people talk about it as it's anaerobic, so it's black and white, it's intense. Resistance training doesn't burn a ton of calories, and it doesn't utilize a ton of carbohydrates unless you're really training hard. So resistance training days, moderate activity days, are days where you would want to carb cycle with more resistant starches. Okay, you might want to bring things in like, for example, potatoes that have been heated and then cooled. Okay, these are a great example of resistant starches. Another example, even though I'm not personally a big fan of oatmeal, is going to be oats, right? You cook them and then you could cool them, put them in the fridge, and it becomes a resistant retrograded starch. What that means is that the body doesn't utilize those carbs the same. They actually turn into more of a fiber, okay? Now with that, you're going to have a less glucose response, but you're still going to develop some of the systems and processes that are okay to help you utilize those carbohydrates better. What I would recommend on the days where you're carb cycling and things like this is add in things like coenzyme Q10, add in things like alpha lipoic acid. These can help with the precursors that might even help you utilize these carbohydrates a little bit more efficiently. You can also add something in like berberine on these days, okay? Now, moving into the more intense days where you're doing, say, higher intensity work, you're doing intervals, or maybe you're very active. These are the days where you would add more in the way of starchy carbohydrates. And when I say more, I don't mean a lot. I just mean, hey, this is the day where you might have a little bit of rice or maybe some more potatoes or things like that. It's plain and simple, but where people get confused is they confuse resistance training with the high intensity days. The high intensity days, you should know what those are, right? Now, the interesting thing is there is a study that takes a look specifically at high intensity exercise and kind of dictates or illustrates what it is, rather. It was published in the European Journal of Sports Science. What they essentially did is for 6 weeks, they had subjects just do 3 days per week of 5 rounds of 1 minute on, a 1.5 minute off. High intensity, right? They were pushing at high intensity for 1 minute, recovering for 1.5 minutes. 5 simple rounds. They found after 6 weeks of this, they ended up improving mitochondrial density, mitochondrial efficiency, and ATP generation from that mitochondria, showing that overall glucose metabolism was improving, all these things. So what that tells us is that those are the kind of high intensity workouts that we would need to justify more carbohydrates. Now that's pretty low volume, right? So pretty impressive. But if you were to do intervals, or if you were to do maybe a Metcon, or something that's really more work and overall volume and work capacity, that's going to be the kind of day where you want to add more carbs in. So the question comes, well, how many days a week should I have carbs and this and that? I exercise every day. What should I do? You really never want to be having more than 4 carbohydrate days, moderate to high carbohydrate days, if you're carb cycling. I don't care what you do if you're not carb cycling. It's just a general kind of rule. Like, you want to have at least like 3 days of low carb and 4 days with carbs. So if that was the case, it would be 3 days of low carb and 2 days moderate, 2 days a little bit more, right? So pretty simple with that. What about the carbohydrate timing though? How do we time these things? Well, we look at that with really simple rules, really simple. If you are active throughout the course of the day, like you are someone that is on your feet, maybe you're a waiter, maybe you're a hostess, maybe you're a mechanic, maybe you're in construction. If you're active, and I can just justify that as probably walking more than maybe 10,000 steps per day. That's a loose kind of guideline. The evidence suggests that having carbohydrates earlier in the day is better for insulin resistance with those kinds of people, because it allows for the proper glucose excursion. It allows for you to use those carbs throughout the course of the day easier compared to having them in the evening. On the contrary, if you are sedentary, it is more ideal to keep it low carb and high protein throughout the course of the day and actually have your carbohydrates allocated to the end of the day. Because you're not active, you don't really want to be adding glucose in when you're not active. That just doesn't add up, right? The body's not going to utilize it. There's something called insulin-independent glucose uptake. When you are moving your body, the cells have the ability to soak up glucose even if insulin's not present. Right? So that means that if you are moving around, even if you're insulin resistant, the carbs that you eat are going to get soaked up through a mechanical sort of suck up of the carbs. But if you're sitting down and you have carbs, you don't have that assisting you. So you are very likely more active after you leave your office job than you would otherwise, right? Like, you're going to be, if you are in your office job working all day, you're sedentary. But you go home, you might be more active. You might be doing some laundry, you might be playing with the kids, you might be cooking dinner. You're likely more active at home than you were throughout the course of the day, meaning you're in a better spot to consume those carbohydrates then, independent of whenever your workout is. But also, you might get a sleep benefit, you might get a number of other benefits compared to the other person that's more active. So the carbohydrate count and how many we have and the days that we have carbohydrates is one equation. When you have those carbs is another. Do not worry about timing your carbohydrates surrounding your workout too much. Yes, it matters if you're an athlete. Yes, it matters for glycogen resynthesis. But if you're looking at insulin resistance, do not get hung up on that. Do not go work out and think that you need to have your carbohydrates post-workout because that's the best time to have them. That's not necessarily always the case. You might be someone that's better off to have those carbohydrates later in the day and continue the fat burning of your workout by not really eating after your workout. Now, here's another really cool, interesting thing. There was a study published in the Journal of Applied Physiology. They had subjects do 19 days of pure bed rest. Then they had another group do 19 days of pure bed rest, except they had them get up in the morning and do 30 isometric reps of leg press. So basically, they put their legs up on a leg press, and they just reduced the weight a little, or reduced the platform down a little bit, so there was an isometric contraction. They did 30 of those, not even full reps, just isometrics. Okay, the difference in terms of the amount of glucose that was able to get taken up was insane. So the people that were only bed rest had a 19% reduction in glucose transporters that would bring glucose in the cell. The people that were on bed rest but did just these 30 isometrics, which would probably take 10 minutes, they had a 30% increase in the glucose translocation, in the GLUT4 translocation, the ability to suck glucose up. What I'm saying here is that the activity makes such a difference. So another thing that you can do if you're a little more like, hey, I want to mess around with carbs in the morning or at different times, if you were to take in carbohydrates during your workout, you wouldn't need any insulin. The body would soak up those carbohydrates. So that's a nice kind of free ride to have carbohydrates. But the reason I mentioned this leg press study is because it tells you how just even a little bit of activity encourages the utilization of glucose. But I hope that the big picture here of what I've been teaching is that it's not just about managing glucose. It's more about removing the glucose so that the body can kind of regain its ability to use different fuel substrates. Stop the confusion about insulin resistance being a glucose problem and understand that this is a more fundamental inflammatory problem where glucose utilization and poor utilization is just a side effect. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. See you tomorrow.